few days ago, me and my good friend Mark Zuckerberg made a video roasting the Apple Vision Pro. A lot of people enjoyed it, but a lot of people got offended as well, because obviously the Apple Vision Pro is the greatest piece of technology ever invented. After that video, I went out and bought a Meta Quest 3, did some soul searching, and have come to realize that I never should have trusted Mark Zuckerberg. In today's video, I will atone for my sins against the Apple religion by building a visionOS app for the Apple Vision Pro from scratch. And believe it or not, you don't even need to own this $3,500 paperweight to start building apps for it. My experience building a basic 3D app was surprisingly smooth and easy, and there's a huge opportunity for developers here who want to make money on this new platform. What we're building today is a basic app that can fetch animated GIFs from the internet, and then we'll layer in some random 3D balls just to figure out how Apple's AR RealityKit works. But before we get into this Apple Vision Pro code tutorial, let's first talk about the VR landscape in general. If you've never tried on a VR headset, you owe it to yourself to go to an Apple store or Best Buy and try the AVP or Meta Quest, because they have a massive wow factor the first time you put one on. I actually have an original Oculus dev kit that's almost 10 years old at this point, and even back then they had that wow factor. I think a lot of normies are freaking out about the Apple Vision Pro because it's their first experience with VR and their minds are blown. But that honeymoon phase doesn't last very long. There's already a lot of reports of people returning their Apple Vision Pros, and I think VR headsets will always be a niche product unless they become significantly smaller and more convenient, but that'll likely take decades of advancement on the hardware side. Despite that, Apple has sold tons of these devices, and it's making VR more mainstream, which means Meta will likely sell more of its devices as well. And when it comes to development, getting in early on a new ecosystem is one of the best ways to make money. In the early days of iOS, you could make $10,000 a day with a fart app. And with visionOS, you have apps like YouTube lagging behind, so developers are selling YouTube apps for $5 a pop until Google builds the official app. Now, the other thing to consider is that building a 3D app tends to be a lot more difficult than building a basic 2D website. The graphics, the gestures, and just the requirements to build a good user experience are a lot more challenging for an indie developer to pull off. Now, the other question is, should you build something for Apple's closed ecosystem, or should you build something for Zuckerberg's quote-unquote open system? It's a tough call with a lot of trade-offs and likely comes down to the device you like more. Here's a quick review of the Meta Quest 3 versus the Apple Vision Pro. The clarity of the graphics as well as the pass-through is way better on the Apple Vision Pro. However, it doesn't beat the clarity of your naked eye, and looking at the outside world through a screen is pretty stupid most of the time. You'll also notice motion blur, and when I take the thing off after using it for a while, I get this weird feeling in my eyes. It just doesn't feel healthy to wear for long periods of time, and surprisingly, I found the Meta Quest 3 to be a bit more comfortable, but neither one of them is fun to wear. Once you're inside your VR world, you've got a bunch of apps to choose from, although with Apple, things are tightly integrated into the Apple ecosystem, so if you use iCloud and things like that, you'll get a much better experience than if you're not an Apple user. When it comes to content, Meta's been working at this for a long time, so they have a ton of different games and apps to use. Like this game Superhot is the most fun I've ever had in VR, period. Whereas the Apple ecosystem is just getting started. In general, Meta's much more focused on gaming because that's what most people use VR for, whereas Apple's trying to kind of start this new paradigm of VR as a productivity tool. The final question is, which one should you buy? Well, the Meta Quest 3 is a much better value, and at a $500 price point, I feel like Meta has to be losing money on this thing, which would make sense because I think they want to subsidize more people into their ecosystem. And Meta already makes an ungodly amount of money from its ad business. But without price considered, the AVP is definitely a more impressive piece of hardware. Apple has always made the best hardware, and this is no exception. Now, as a developer, if you want to build something for Meta Quest, you'll likely use a game engine like Unity or Unreal Engine. You can also use Unity for Apple Vision Pro, but if you're not already familiar with Unity, you're likely better off just going directly to Apple's SDK and build your app with SwiftUI. And that's what we're going to do now. In order to do that, you'll need to have a modern Mac running Apple Silicon, along with the latest Xcode installed. From there, we can go to File, New, Project, and navigate to the visionOS app template. The most interesting option here is Immersive Space, which can be full, mixed, or progressive. With full, you're totally immersed in a 3D world like true VR. In mixed reality, you can see the outside world along with some 3D objects inside of it, and then progressive allows you to transition between the two different states. For this tutorial, we'll go with mixed. That'll generate the template, then bring us to this Hello World content view. Now, inside this app, we have two different paradigms to work with. We have windows, which are these 2D things that look like pieces of paper flying in space, and that's where the main UI is going to go. But we also have volumes, which you can think of as a 3D object that takes up some volume in the space. Now, the end user is going to want to interact with both windows and volumes, but the way they do that in visionOS is very unique. Some interactions are direct, where the user puts their finger directly on an object and performs some type of gesture that you can then handle in your code. code. Like in this app, we'll eventually have a button that the user can tap. What's weird though is that other interactions can be indirect. Because visionOS has eye tracking, a person's eye can indicate an element that they want to interact with, then they can pinch their fingers together instead of tapping it directly. Pretty cool, but now it's time to write some code. We're using Apple's Swift programming language along with SwiftUI, which is their framework for UI design that actually feels pretty similar to Flutter. What you'll notice is that we have a content view, then inside that view we can nest different widgets like text and buttons to build out the UI in a hierarchy. First we have a VStack, which is like a vertical column of elements. Inside that stack we can then add a button. Then we can chain methods to it to modify its appearance by adding padding, changing the color, or adjust the shape to make it more rounded. What you'll notice is that as we make these changes, they're automatically updated in the simulator. What's cool about Xcode is that it has a built-in visionOS simulator, so you don't even need to own the Apple Vision Pro to develop apps for it. But now that we have a button, we need to make it do something useful. So inside of it, I'm going to call a method that will fetch a GIF from the Giphy API. Ironically, Giphy is a company that's owned by Meta, so Mark might not be too happy about me using it to build an Apple Vision Pro app. To use it, you'll need an API key, but once you have that, you can make a request to that API for a random GIF. So it's just a really simple API to integrate into an app like this. So now inside our fetch GIF method, we'll first create a URL data task that sends an HTTP request to the Giphy API. That happens asynchronously and responds with either data or an error, but the thing that was actually surprisingly tricky here was deserializing the JSON back into Swift code. It has this JSON decode method, but in order to use it, we need a struct that represents the shape of the JSON data from Giphy. So to do that, I created a few structs here that use the codable type, which ensures the data can be encoded and decoded with JSON. Now that we have that, we can use that in the JSON decode method. And finally, once we have the actual image URL, we can set that as a property on the struct itself, which then allows us to use it anywhere in the UI. To do that, we can go back into the VStack and we'll add an async image component, but this time wrap it in a conditional that checks to make sure the GIF URL is defined, because without that URL, we can't show an image. And now if we click on that button, we should get a random image in the UI. And now we have a minimum viable product for a $1 million visionOS app. One problem though is that the GIF animations don't seem to play, but to be honest, I don't really care enough to figure out why, because now what I want to do is add some actual 3D objects to the scene. Apple has this SDK called RealityKit that tries to make this process as easy as possible. For example, the starter code comes with a 3D model, so let's go ahead and add model 3D to the UI. It's referring to a 3D model named scene, which you can find in the packages directory under RealityKit content. Then as you can see here, it adds this little gray ball to the UI. But now let's go in the File Explorer and click on the scene. That'll isolate the shape so we can view it here in 3D. However, there's another tool called Reality Composer Pro, and we can access it by clicking on this button up here on the top right. This tool is a 3D editor kind of like Blender that allows you to add different nodes to the scene and then customize them by modifying the mesh and adding materials to it. This is probably the best way to design a 3D scene, but we can also do it programmatically. Let's go back into our UI code and create a new view called balls. Inside of it, we'll add a new reality view that calls a method called generateSphere. In fact, we'll put this code inside a loop to generate 5 spheres. We can customize its radius, and then to give it some actual color, we need to add a material to it, which in this case will be a simple material that's red and metallic. And then after that, we'll generate some random numbers to use as the position for the sphere. Now we have these random balls floating around in space, but we can also make these interactive, and that's because RealityKit has things like colliders that can detect gestures from the user or other things in the environment. What we're doing here is adding a collision component to the sphere that has the same radius, which then makes it possible to chain this gesture method to it to listen to a tap gesture. When a sphere is tapped, we'll go ahead and toggle the scale property on the struct. That's going to trigger an update in the UI where we can run some code. In this case, we'll loop over all of the spheres and update their scale to a different size. And now in the Apple Vision Pro, we should have this totally useless new feature. Although it's useless, it gives us a pretty good idea for how things work in this platform. The bottom line is that building apps for visionOS is probably a lot easier than you actually think. If you have some basic 3D design and coding skills, it's not all that hard to deliver that VR wow factor to end users. My goal over the next few months is to do a lot more coding tutorials, so let me know what you want to see in the comments. And if you want more content right now, become a pro member at Fireship.io. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.